Ya Palagina, hello and welcome everyone. It's so lovely to be here and to present to you, mob. My name is Nicole Hewlett and I'm a proud Palawa woman from Lectruida, Tasmania. And today I'm here to talk to you about culturally responsive palliative care for our people. But before I do that, and most importantly, today and every day, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and the waters that we're all zooming in from. And I'm on Turrbal and Yagara country of Mianjin, Brisbane, and I'd like to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, and of course extend this respect to all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that might be listening today. It's important to acknowledge that we're all on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, always was, always will be, and that our sovereignty was never ceded. I just want to begin this session, I suppose, coming from where I believe that we all need to sit a space. Because a lot of the stuff that comes up here can be quite challenging. And I want to encourage everyone listening to tap into a heart space that we typically do quite organically or intuitively with Aboriginal people. And so how do we do this? How do we tap into our heart space and sit there and observe? I think one of the greatest illusions that has ever existed is the illusion that we are our thoughts. And I think, you know, in terms of the amount of noise that goes on in our heads, it prevents us from listening deeply. So what do I mean by this, to sink into your heart space? If everyone could just close their eyes and take a really deep breath in and then slowly exhale out. I want you to think of your next thought. Now, chances are there was a long pause there before the next thought came into your mind. So if we are our thoughts, what observes that? And that's the space that I encourage you all to sit in today as I present. That heart space, or the observer of the thoughts. And before I get into palliative care, I'm not sure how many of you have worked in palliative care or with our community or both. But I want to begin with this story. And the story goes with that a medical specialist was treating a young boy that was terminal. And one day the medical specialist asked the boy's father if he could record the son's heartbeat for the father. And the father agreed, so the specialist recorded the heartbeat. Now, he also happened to be a musician. So he turned that heartbeat into a song for the father to keep for when the boy had passed. Now, the father listened to that song every day because the song, you know, it captured the boy's spirit and it allowed him to connect with his son after he passed and brought healing in the most beautiful ways. And I tell you this because this is palliative care. It's treating the spirit or the soul. In fact, you know, it's the only Western concept that comes close to the way in which we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples view health. It's holistic and it's a strengths-based focus on the, you know, on the quality of life. And it doesn't just cover pain, it covers everything, including physical, social, psychological, emotional, cultural and spiritual aspects that make us who we are. And I don't know of any other kind of care in the non-Indigenous system that incorporates spiritual and cultural as fundamental components of giving care. But on every one of those aspects that I just mentioned, our communities differ. So if you have a look at this map here, it's a map of all of our different Aboriginal language groups that we have in Australia. And there are roughly around 300. And each of these communities, they don't just differ according to where they are located and the environment and resources around them, but each has their own unique practices, histories, obviously language, beliefs, knowledge, and kinship structures. And even within these communities, there is significant variability just within the families and the songlines that get handed down. So you can imagine, how overwhelming it can be when someone is asked to speak on behalf of all Aboriginal peoples, given that diversity. Because you can only really do that in a very vague or broad sense. And then, of course, we add our, Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, and they may as well be an entirely different country because they're a completely different culture altogether. And I can certainly, not speak on behalf of these mob any more than I can speak on behalf of a Japanese person. But when I do so with permission. I always like just to premise any presentation I do with that before I sort of talk about perhaps some of the similarities our communities have. So historically and currently, what are our, belief systems and worldviews, particularly around that end of life journey? Well, our ancient practices saw passing as something really sacred. It was a sacred celebration because we were returning to country and becoming an ancestral spirit in our dreaming. And that was so, and is so deeply revered. But of course, with, colonization, there was the Christianity that accompanied that. And all of a sudden, this fear of death was introduced. This possibility that, when we die, we could end up in this place of, torture or hell for eternity. And this fear of death, naturally continues today. And traditionally, and for a lot of us Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today, even those that have taken on introduced religions like Christianity, our beliefs around health and well-being are grounded in a sense of belonging. And that belonging is, typically to land, to sea, to other people, to one's culture. And many of us believe that we come from the land, and when we pass, we go back to land, that we're all spirits on this, life, death, life continuum or journey. And that's what that picture on the screen represents. So many of us believe that, all living things, doesn't matter if it's, people, animals, plants, rocks, all of it has a spirit. And these spirits connect living to, the past, present, and the future. We are connected, fundamentally, we believe we are connected to our ancestors. And we access these ancestors and their guidance through country, through land, through ceremony, and even through ourselves in our stories. But at the same time, there's this awareness that we are ancestors, of the future. So you can see why country or land is so significant. It is our connection to our past, which is, our ancestors, to our present day with our health, and to our future, which is tied in with our hope. And in Aboriginal society, everyone and everything is interrelated and interconnected. And that's not just land and family, that's stars as well. And there's that oneness. And this is what we call our dreaming. And for Torres Strait Islander peoples, that spirituality draws upon stories of Tagai. But I always find it's quite limited, the English language, when I'm trying to describe things like the dreaming, because it is so transcendent and it's so profound that it's almost beyond language to describe. But given this perspective, our health and well-being is holistic and it is transcendent. And when it comes to palliative care, many of us need to return, spirit back to country in order for us to continue on that life, death, life journey. Now, different communities might have different protocols and ceremonies around that, but traditionally, that life, death, life journey and our relationship with country is similar across all of our cultures. Now, despite, country being so significant to us, it's really important to note that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people no longer live on traditional country or their ancestral country. I certainly don't, but in no way does that diminish their or my cultural or spiritual connections to country. So if it's our way, if we've got all of these beautiful, cultural and spiritual worldviews and frameworks in which our societies operate in, why don't we access palliative care? Well, there are many known barriers for our community accessing palliative care. But before I get into that, I want to take a moment here to pause and again ask you all to close your eyes and take a deep inhale and hold. And as you exhale, do that as slowly as possible. And if you could do that 2 more times, that would be excellent. Now, from this space, I want to ask you to observe what comes up for you when you hear the word Aboriginal. Now, what comes up for you is personal, and I definitely don't need you to share, but I encourage you not to judge whatever came up for you. I encourage you to witness it, to observe it, and to compassionately explore why that came up for you. You know, we are all products, of our environment and all the messaging within it from the moment we entered into this world. And all of us have biases because it's the way our brains as human beings function. We need to group information, stereotype information, because it's efficient. And we do this all very unconsciously. Unfortunately, the message around our community has been profoundly, racist and derogatory and full of stereotypes since colonisation. And that is the environment that each and every one of you have been raised in. Knowing that, and knowing that we are a product of our environment, it's important that we don't deny what might come up for us, but instead compassionately explore it and unpack it so that it doesn't impact on your practice and engagement with our people. Only then can we genuinely, change our hearts. And that's the goal here with all of our IPEPA workshops with non-Indigenous health professionals. But I'll get into more about that heart reading and changing in a moment. Our barriers. So in terms of accessing palliative care, there are 10 known barriers for our community. So first off the ranks is the lack of awareness and understanding of palliative care. Now, even though Aboriginal peoples have been doing palliative care and looking after our elders and sick ones since the dawn of time, we've never called it that, palliative care. It's not our language, and we don't actually have a word for it. Those that are familiar with the word palliative typically have terrible experiences in things like hospitals or by individuals or organisations. And these sorts of stories flood our grapevines in every community. And now that we have things like Facebook and the like, those stories are faster and furious than they've ever been before. So for many, that word palliative care is quite stigmatised in our community. And there is a lot of misunderstanding around what it actually is. So if it's associated with, hospitals, death, pain, loss, trauma, all negative things, a lot of us, steer clear of anything to do with it, including any Grim Reaper, workers within it. So often this means, our communities are caring for our sick family members, and they're doing that alone. Without any support or resources. And that's one thing that IPEPA and many other palliative care projects, including Gwanggalam and Aboriginal and non-Indigenous projects, are hoping to change. So this lack of awareness and misunderstanding of palliative care, of course, contributes to another barrier, which is the lack of or late referral to or initiation of palliative care. And one thing that I find captures this nicely is, to many non-Indigenous people, hospital is a place where you go to heal. But for most of our community, hospital is a place where you go to die. So naturally, we don't typically start palliative care because for us, that's then admitting or accepting the fact that we are going to die within days. Racism and discrimination, historical and current, plus that cultural stereotyping. So I don't need to probably tell you, Mob, this, but there is endless literature of the experiences of racism in health systems for our people, you know, where our community have received culturally unsafe or much poorer care or no care at all as a result of being Aboriginal and Torres or Strait Islander. And this is you know, a systemic barrier across the nation, because these institutions are, you know, they're non-Indigenous, and therefore they're intrinsically built on non-Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing, which is, you know, often at odds with our ways. And of course that then perpetuates the next barrier, where we have a fear or mistrust of Western medicine and all the healthcare providers and services within it. It's really important to also note here that many of these institutions had things that are fundamentally based around, you know, religion. And when you look at our stolen generation survivors who suffered at the hands of many of these religious institutions, already we have a very entrenched fear, and it's very triggering, these religious institutions. But I won't get into that yet. The next up we have is the language and communication issues. So I hear this barrier, you know, time and time again from our people, and it really is a, you know, a whole day workshop, but I will touch on it here. So from our people, we may be reluctant to talk about death and dying because it's taboo, or we believe that by talking about it, we could somehow manifest it or bring it closer. And if our people hold these beliefs, the way that you introduce palliative care matters tremendously. But of course, how you introduce palliative care and manage those yarns or those conversations will be much easier if you know your client, you're connected with them, and you have trust from them. And it's also important to remember that this isn't our system. So our literacy in your ways may be poor. So we may nod and pretend to understand what you and your big medical jargon words are saying, but we're only nodding because we know it'll get us out of that room as soon as possible, and then we can just leg it. And this is where often sometimes not only does the trust help, but where visual and culturally appropriate resources is vital. Remember that, you know, we didn't have writing up on the walls of our, you know, caves. We had pictures, because you can capture so many more holistic layers of meaning with pictures. And the same goes with our oral storytelling. So it's really important that you think about how you're going to tell the palliative care story to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person sitting in front of you. You may need professional interpretation services if you're in a place where mobs speak 5 to 6 languages, but these are available, and they're all fundamental to trust and to creating access for our community. But either way, it's really important to understand that fundamentally we are heart-reading people, and as heart-reading people, communication and language is, you know, it's just so much more than what is said. It's the feeling we absorb from you. More often than not, our people typically connect spiritually and from that place of, you know, belonging. And it's the same place that our sense of knowing we are Aboriginal, that we're connected to country, comes from. Now, communication does, you know, underpin a lot of the barriers that I'm going to present to you today. And that's because, you know, I guess how you make someone feel that is sitting in front of you is a reflection of your heart and your intent. And that can be busyness and a no-time heart, but more often than not, it's a heart that has its own beliefs about our people, conscious or not. And something that might have come up for you when I just asked you before about, you know, what comes up for you when you think of the word Aboriginal. So the mismatching of beliefs. So when it comes to obviously the non-Indigenous system, you know, there is often you know, one is holistic. Our ways are holistic. It's layered, it's visual, it's, you know, it incorporates country and culture and spirituality at its core. It's not siloed. And that can often be at odds with non-Indigenous systems. And it's really about how we can incorporate culture and country at this incredible, you know, and very sacred time. And it's also around, you know, ensuring that, you know, our preferences for family-based or kinship-determined decision-making is embedded in the practice from non-Indigenous organisations and people. So understanding that for us, family-centred care is so important, and the importance of our kinship dynamics, and also your role in ensuring that you are talking to the appropriate person. Because if you step wrong in this space, you can cause a lot of conflict in our families, which then can complicate our grief as a result. So it's important to remember that many of us do not see ourselves as separate in any way from our families. We belong to them, and our kinship systems, you know, govern our roles and responsibilities in our families and communities more widely. And that includes, you know, decision making. And this is why palliative care is family-centred. And therefore, when there's any discussions or decisions that need to be made, often you will need to have family conferences so that all of us are on that journey with the person that is seriously sick. And this is linked, obviously, with the mismatching cultural, religious and health beliefs, but as well as our preference for family-centred care. But yeah, it challenges accommodating cultural practices in palliative care settings, like including smoking ceremonies that are essential for our ceremonial practices for our passing spirit, or having larger family rooms so that families can visit and spend that, you know, special time that is required and that we have responsibility to do when we're at that end of life journey. And often the system is just not set up for that. But in saying that, there are lots of changes that are happening, and there are some beautiful examples of organisations and hospices accommodating large families so that those business practices can unfold, as well as other organisations or hospitals shutting down the fire alarm so that those smoking practices can occur. So we are shifting, and there are precedents of, you know, changing the way so that we can accommodate some very important cultural practices at this part of our journey. And then, of course, there is financial disadvantage. The highlighted barriers here are where you can help in terms of breaking down the barriers of access to palliative care for our people. And what is that role? So it's huge, because most of the palliative care workforce is non-Indigenous, and most of our barriers, you know, have emerged because of experiences with non-Indigenous institutions and peoples. So I'm grateful to each and every one of you, you know, because clearly you are here today because you want to be part of the solution, and you are instrumental, you know, in our community's access. So it really takes all of us working together in solidarity to break down, you know, these systemic barriers of these institutions that, you know, are foreign to us. But I realise, you know, this is all very, you know, warm and fuzzy, and it probably skips, you know, the key and most important question of, you know, how do you do that? And I've really only got, you know, moments in the, you know, broad scheme of things to communicate that enormity. But it really, I guess, it really comes down to your willingness to undertake, you know, a transformative journey. You know, and that requires, you know, your openness to listening, learning, you know, changing, and most importantly, surrendering your ways of knowing, being and doing. And often that will require you to understand that there are different ways of caring. And sometimes that might include, you know, important people in our palliative care journeys, such as, you know, these ones highlighted. And by doing things differently, I mean, it also starts with these yarns. And these yarns or these talks, these discussions with us, they have to be holistic and shared, which means your privilege is stripped. And we are equal in this two-way process where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the healthcare professionals, they make the decisions together. And as you can see by this model, sharing your story and your truth is crucial to this relationship because it really coincides with feelings of trust and safety for us. Only then can we, tell our story, including what culture means to us, what our spiritual connections mean to us, and what our kinship system means to us, if we have that. Because each of these are as, unique to each and every one of us as our fingerprint. And it's impossible for you to know everything and to learn everything about our culture, as you've just heard. So it's about connection and, importantly, trust with the person and their family sitting in front of you. And there's just not going to be any other lesson that you're going to get from anyone else than from the person sitting in front of you and deeply listening to them. And I realise, with our community, you might be nervous and caught up in your head about everything that you've learned. And even, this model that you see on screen, and you might try to play it all out at once. Should I look them in the eye? Should I not? Am I going to say the wrong thing? Should I hug them, sing to them? All of this circus of thoughts that's going on in your head will disconnect you because you lose the realness. And I also find, often many of us are uncomfortable with silences. So many non-Indigenous people are uncomfortable with silence. And I find that many non-Indigenous assume that they're doing things wrong if there's long silences. But instead, usually what's going on in those silences is our people are processing and they're reflecting before they provide a very considered response. So I really encourage you to be mindful of that and to remember that for us and for many cultures, storytelling is, a bridge, and it's a bridge to building, intimacy and trust and connection. And how can you do that? Well, this is a beautiful model on the screen that you see here. And it was built by our community for our community. And my deepest respects, to the members living and working in Eora and Wilayakali and Gundagara, Wiradjuri, Bunjalung, Darug and Yuin lands, who all designed this gorgeous model. And it was actually developed to support our community to make informed decisions around COVID vaccinations. But you can see, how applicable it is to more, to wider areas, including palliative care, because it's really about making our people feel safe and trusted to make informed decisions about ourselves. And really, to the spirit of this, it's, nothing about us without us. Now, the circular design of the model and everything in it, it represents the holistic concepts of Aboriginal health. And as we've said before, like the physical, social, emotional, cultural and spiritual wellbeing for the individual and the community, that is inherent across all areas of care, no matter if you're in palliative care or diabetes, for example. And that's why it's so beautiful to see palliative care, have spiritual and cultural aspects embedded within that care. Now, the circle represents a continuous cycle of a person moving through when they're interacting with the health system and making decisions about their health. It's really about they're finding their way and navigating, forward, backward, and in a sideways direction. So ultimately, these circles really represent, I guess, the scaffolding needed for our people to make those health decisions. Those inner 8 circles that represent, the core elements of shared decision making and opening doors. You can go to the website, and when you click on those, the circular pictures bring up little question prompts and yarning ideas in the respective heading areas, and they are it's really awesomely adapted to mobile phones as well. So you can bring that up and have a play with it wherever you are. I just wanted to highlight, this tool as something practical to give you all, and hopefully you find it useful. I find it just incredible, and I know a lot of other people do as well. So what does this all mean? If I could leave you with just one piece of advice today, then I guess, my number one tip would be, no matter what, always give deep, genuine listening. This is really, the only way that you're going to give space for storytelling and allowing that bridge of intimacy and trust and connection to build. I realise you mob, you're busy, and this is where we have to think creatively of how we can make the system more, accessible to our people. Each and every one of you are, deadly smart, and I truly believe that, if you have that passion and you have that will, then you'll absolutely find a way. Because at the heart of all of this, it's time that we need with you. Otherwise, we can't read your heart. We won't understand you, and we won't connect with you. And how do we trust someone that we don't feel connected to or we don't understand? If anything, in that misunderstanding, fear sits there. And that's why so many of our people are scared of hospital or health or of anything to do with the system. And then when we have, non-Indigenous health professionals coming from that system and mimicking its busy, process-oriented, siloed ways that, for us essentially lacks a lot of that heart, it only further, exacerbates our fears. And we will do everything to avoid feeling that. And that includes running away. Any human would. So, when you have the ultimate privilege of sitting in front of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, I encourage you to share your story and not your professional one. Make it real. Strip away that privilege and let us connect with you. Let us get to know you. Where did you come from? Who's your family? Where do you live? What makes you you? Then tell me, nothing about my journey, but you are here to listen and to learn. Honestly, it's as simple as that. And I promise you that every time you speak to an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person, you will learn something deep and something that will move your spirit and change your heart in some way. But, you need to be open to that learning and understand that you don't have to have all the answers, and we don't expect you to. So if you want to know a little bit more around how you might support our community, or you want to upskill more in palliative care, it's such a beautiful space, and I haven't met a single person that works in palliative care that hasn't said what a privilege it is to work in palliative care and be part of people's stories and weaves in this really special way. We're in every jurisdiction, and as you can see, we have these placements, which are 2 to 4 day experiences in a palliative care service, whether that be in a community one or an inpatient or even a hospital-based specialist palliative care. And they're supervised, and you can essentially get hands-on practice in palliative care. And we also have reverse PEPAs, which is available everywhere as well. And that's where palliative care specialists will travel to your place of employment to facilitate, small group learning among all of your staff. And that's usually quite brilliant as well, because it brings the whole service along with you on this journey around how you can sort of orient your service to be culturally inclusive, responsive, and I suppose improved capacity in delivering palliative care. There's also other very deadly workshops. So we've got IPEPA workshops. This one's for Aboriginal health professionals, but we also have culturally bigger versions of what I've just presented to you. So culturally responsive palliative care. Gwendolyn have a suite of online palliative care workshops, which are specific to how to support our community in palliative care. And it's targeted at non-Indigenous health professionals, and they are just brilliant, and you can access them anytime. They're already up on the website. And Caring at Home has resources to support community that are caring for mob at home. There's also some clinical yarning modules, and these ones, I think they're now published, but they're all about how you might have social yarns. So on these ones, you can practice how you might share your story, or how you might listen deeply, or give clinical information in a way that is easy to understand. We also have cultural considerations resource at IPEPA. You can order those. The Healing Foundation have some beautiful resources around how you can support our survivors, and that's a lot around, you know, trauma informed and healing aware care, and how you can avoid triggering populations that have got, you know, trauma backgrounds, particularly in institutions. And then, of course, there's the Australian Indigenous Health Infonet, which has got just everything from depression to diabetes, and a whole palliative care page dedicated for our community. So if you have any questions that come up for you, or you want to have a yarn with me, there are my details. Please don't hesitate to get in contact, hey, but just be aware that I can talk underwater about this stuff. So yeah, that's just a warning. Otherwise, I should be here and ready to take questions in a live form. Thank you.